When you use relative, absolute, or fixed positioning on elements, you may end up with several elements occupying the same space. This can make elements overlap or completely cover up other elements from view. For example, when you scroll down the Best City Guide page, the entire figure element overlaps the fixed header when it reaches the top of the page. So, why isn't it scrolling under the header like the rest of the content on the page? You see, positioned elements like the header and figure follow a stacking order that determines which elements display above or below other elements. And by default, the stacking order of positioned elements is the order they appear in the source code. So elements that appear later in the code sit on top of elements that appear earlier in the code. In the HTML, the figure element appears below main header in the source code. Because of this, the figure element is higher than main header in the stacking order, so it overlaps it. We can adjust the stacking order of relative, absolute, and fixed positioned elements with the z-index property. The z-index property is directly related to stacking order, and it's what prevents elements from overlapping other elements. It's called z-index because it affects an element's position along the z-axis. When you position an element top, right, bottom, or left, you're positioning the elements in two-dimensional space on the x and y axis. So z-index adds a third axis to your page called the z-axis, and this axis moves elements towards the front and back of the page. An element with a higher z-index value overlaps an element with a lower z-index value. For example, an element with a z-index of 20 will appear over the top of one with a z-index of 10, and an element with a z-index of 30 will appear over one with a z-index of 20 or 10. Positioned elements have a z-index of 0 by default. So to position main header over the figure element, I can give it any z-index value higher than 0. So right below the top declaration, I'll add a z-index property and give it a z-index value of 1. So now I've established a new stacking order for main header. And when I scroll the page, notice how the figure scrolls under the header. So great, it's fixed. Back in my style sheet, if I give icon location a z-index that's slightly higher, so let's say z-index 2, now the icon has a higher stacking order than main header, so it overlaps the header when they occupy the same space. So I'm going to define a much higher z-index for main header just in case I decide to add more positioned elements to the page later. So I'll change the z-index value from 1 to 1000. This way I know my header will be the highest in the stacking order. Remember, z-index will only work on an element with a position property set to absolute, fixed, or relative. If you try to set a z-index on an element with no position, it will do nothing. Also, when you give a positioned element a z-index, you establish a new stacking context for any descendants or children of that element. For example, if I apply relative or absolute positioning to the name or main nav elements inside main header and give them a z-index, that z-index value will be relative to main header's z-index of 1000. So it is possible to have a higher z-index element that's underneath another element with a lower z-index. And you can read more about stacking context in the teacher's notes. I suggest experimenting with z-index values on your own. It's a concept that's best understood by adding positioned and non-positioned elements to a page and experimenting with the different z-index values. In the teacher's notes, you'll find a link to a workspace demo on z-index. Congrats! You've come a long way as a designer and developer of CSS layouts. Now that you understand the strengths and benefits of using layout methods like inline block, floats, and positioning, you should start thinking about how to use them in your projects to build amazing layouts. So what's next? Well, to practice what you learned in this course right now, you can build the other pages of the Best City Guide website, or use the project from this course to create your own portfolio site. You can redesign the layout of your website using a mobile-first approach, or revisit recent projects and see if you noticed any of the strange browser behaviors covered in this course, like collapsing containers or overlapping elements. And if you notice any, now you know how to fix them. The Treehouse community is always here to help. So if you have questions about anything covered in this course, feel free to reach out to the Treehouse staff, other students, or you can get a hold of me on Twitter. I'm @GilAge. Thanks, everyone.